Hi guys, this is Pete Clark here for RunItOnce.com, and this is From the Ground Up. Today we are moving on to episode number 15. I'm going to talk about the difference between polar and linear 3-betting. So let's get right into it. So there are two extreme types of 3-bet range that are often best at the micro and low stakes, and this is due to our fold equity at these stakes usually being much higher or much lower than it ought to be. And these ranges are polar ranges. That's when fold equity is a lot higher than it should be when our opponents are folding too much to 3-bets. And fully linear ranges when our fold equity is lower than it should be and our opponents are not folding enough to 3-bets. We'll also discuss mixed ranges, but we're going to do that next time. Mixed ranges are more of a compromise kind of strategy. They're a bit closer to something game theory optimal, and a mixed strategy will perform better when fold equity is kind of average or unknown. Whereas today we're going to look at times when it's higher or lower than it should be. So basically there's a model that I use with all of my students, which is that when fold equity is average or unknown, we're going to use a mixed strategy. We're going to see that next time. But to start with, we want to work out how to adapt ourselves to situations where the fold equity is lower than it should be or higher than it should be. The better the fold equity, the more polarized you want your approach to be. And that is because if villain is folding a lot, there's a lot less reason to 3-bet a medium strength hand. If you think about it, villain opens in the hijack and you develop a 3-bet range on the button and you decide to 3-bet something like ace queen off, you might just find there that whenever villain folds, he folds a dominated or fairly low EV or equity hand. And when he continues, your ace queen off is in pretty bad shape. So against people who significantly filter their ranges when they face your 3-bets, you're better off 3-betting them with very strong hands that are still ahead even after they've done that significant filtering and folded a lot of their combos, or with hands that are bluffing and couldn't really flat, that are just taking advantage of the fold equity that they're getting being more than it should be. On the other side of the scale, the linear range is basically, linear means from the top down. It means 3-betting aces all the way down to wherever you stop 3-betting. So linear is all about just using big hands when fold equity is lower. There are other reasons to use linear ranges, as we're going to see in a minute, but that is the main fold equity-based one. And in the middle, we'll move on next time and talk about mixed strategies that are a little bit more GTO-friendly. So first off, we'll start with polar 3-betting, and we'll just make sure we get our head around what this means, when we'd like to do it, and what we're trying to achieve, and why we do it in the situations that we'd like to do it. This is a polarized spectrum. Back in something like 2011, when poker was in the dark ages, or still kind of in the dark ages, I made a video and I called this the spectrum of 3-betting. And my fatal assumption back then that, youthful me made was that every 3-bet range has to somehow start off as a polarized range, which is not true. A polarized range is something that there's a time and a place for, but like I said, it's when there's a lot of fold equity. Also, it's quite crucial that when we're using a polarized range that we have this calling range as well. What's going on here in this model? Well, at the top we're using value hands, and when we're 3-betting polar, a value hand is one that we think is in good shape after we get called. So people make the mistake all the time of saying, I 3-bet this hand because I felt like it was good, or I felt like villain's range was wide, or something like that. Well, if villain is folding a lot of his range to that 3-bet, it could still be the case that you just want to call with a lot of quite strong hands and save your 3-betting either for hands that are clearly bluffs that don't have good calling EV. Hands are a bit too weak to call, as we can see here on the left of the calling range, we have the 3-bet bluffs. And then hands on the right-hand side of the calling range that are too strong to call. So polarized 3-betting is all about 3-betting with two distinct groups of hands, ones that are too bad to call, bluffs, and too good to call, which are value hands. The requirements for being polar are 1, high fold equity. Otherwise, why would we 3-bet such bluffing hands, and why wouldn't we 3-bet more for value? If we think fold equity is lower, there'd absolutely be no point in adopting a polar strategy because we'd be missing out on clear value bets by using this tight, implied, strong value range. We could expand that down and turn a lot of those calling hands in dark blue there into 3-bets for value as well. And we'd want to do away with that 3-bet bluff range. If villain is in position and calling all of our 3-bets, it doesn't really make sense to bloat the pot with 7-6 suited. We need to think that there's a decent amount of pre-flop fold equity to make that a sensible play. So this polar idea really only works when you have high fold equity. Otherwise, you just want to bring the 3-bet range to the top, basically, and just expand that value range, getting rid of the bluffing range, and that will create the other type of range we'll look at today, which is your linear strategy. Because the calling range is the separator. It's the buffer between the 3-bet value range and the 3-bet bluff range. You do also need a calling range. This separates bluffs from value. Polar means poles, North Pole, South Pole. In the context of the Earth, it would make no sense to talk about the North Pole and the South Pole if we didn't have the world in between. They would just be things that were together and they would be linear. They would not be polar. So North and South are polar because there is all this stuff that is less North and less South. Basically, here that is the calling range. We have the 3-bet value range, the 3-bet bluff range, and the calling range resides in between. The reason that it does that is that we think these calling hands in a high fold equity environment are just not worth turning into bluffs because they perform so well as flats. If villain is folding a ton to a 3-bet and giving you most of your fold equity by just folding, most of your EV, by just pre-flop fold equity, giving it up pre-flop, then we don't need a good hand to take advantage of that. We are better off actually using some hands that have some potential. Our 3-bet bluffing range here could be 7-5 suited or ace-8 off, or it really just depends on the situation. Generally, though, we would favour the more suited or connected or blocker-rich variants of hand. But these hands are good for bluffing with because they can't call, so we're not squandering an already good calling hand by 3-bet bluffing it against a guy that folds all the time. Rather, we're flatting a hand like 8s or king queen or ace jack or ace queen even, or even 10s or jacks in some cases, and playing those hands as high EV flats, and then acknowledging that when we 3-bet, most of our EV comes from villain folding, so we just use weaker hands that we can't call. They will gain more EV. You might be able to 3-bet ace queen really profitably against a guy that folds too often, but you're not gaining much over calling. And if in the long run you run that 3-bet stat up really, really high, and you start 3-betting 15, 16% of hands in common spots, then you're going to lose a lot of that fold equity, and that's why the hands that get the most out of that fold equity, that utilize it in the most impactful way, are going to be the bluffs that can't get an EV by calling. Therefore, they would otherwise be folds, and folding is 0 EV. So if their 3-bet EV is very high, they're gaining, the EV gain is 0 plus whatever that is. It's quite a lot. They're gaining by not folding. If a hand is already really high EV as a call, it won't gain that much EV by being turned into a 3-bet bluff. This is how the polar logic goes. It does require these two things, high fold equity and a calling range, to separate the two parts. Here's an example. So we have a nitty reg opening here in the cutoff to $6 in a 1-2 game, and we are on the button. Behind us, there's a tight passive player. And that's really important because that's one less player that's going to squeeze us. We already saw in earlier episodes on pre-flop how having a passive player behind us can give us a license to call a lot more hands than we ordinarily would with regs behind. If we have two very solid professionals or tight aggressive players or loose aggressive regulars behind us, we're going to get squeezed a lot. We're not going to be wanting to enter the pot by calling super often here, and because of rate considerations and getting squeezed off of our holdings when we flat, we may, in the case of regs behind, just choose to use a 3-bet or fold strategies. We saw already. That's revision. In this situation, though, we are going to develop a calling range, and that's because we're incentivized to get into pots with the tight passive player in the small blind. The guy in the big blind, if he's unknown, he may be a reg, but a lot of the times, especially if you move up to like 50, 100, 200 NL, and you're playing in a Zoom pool, let's say, and you play at the same kind of times of day every week that people normally do because they have jobs and routines and things like that, the chances are that you're going to know most of the regs in your game, and some new player who crops up, while he could be a reg, he's quite likely just to be a weaker recreational who's just dipping into the pool for the first time or for the first time in a while. So this table is very promising for flatting. There's at least one, possibly two weaker players behind us. The chances of getting squeezed are not that big, and so we can build a flatting range here, and that is, of course, one of the requirements for having a polarized strategy. That's one box ticked. The other box is the high fold equity. We do think that's true as well. Villain is a nitty reg, so nitty regs typically will still steal fairly wide from the cutoff. They are regs after all. We're not saying they open like no hands here, but they're going to be reluctant to defend a lot of those hands to a squeeze, so both to a 3-bet. So both of our conditions for adopting a polar strategy are present here, and we're going to go ahead and do that. What's it going to look like? So our polar range in this case is going to be very nitpicky and selective about the hands that it wants to 3-bet for value. We're using jacks, queens, kings, aces, and not 10s and not 9s. These are calls, as we can see here. The reason we're not 3-betting hands like ace, queen off, or king, queen suited, or 10s is that we feel that after we've built the pot to that extent against an out-of-position nitty player, and after we've been either 4-bet or called, 4-betting obviously being notably worse than being called, we're not going to be in great shape, and there's not going to be a great gain for 3-betting this player. Moreover, the players in the blinds are going to really boost our EV if we let them come into the pot when we have a good multi-way sort of hand like 9s or 8s or something like that, or even ace queen off can dominate a lot of the bad pairs that they will end up flopping with their ranges being too wide pre-flop. So if the tight passive guy ends up just playing too many dominated offsuit broadways as the call, it's going to be fine for us to call ace queen off on the button here. So polarized strategy, both boxes high fold equity and calling range. This is what it looks like. As you can see, we're very strict here with how we build the bluffing range. The bluffs are hands that are certainly not strong enough to gain a lot of EV, at least by calling. So we're not bluffing with queen jack suited because that has really high calling EV. Instead, we're using 7-6 suited or 10-8 or ace-5. We're using hands that we think flop less well and therefore have a bigger EV difference by 3-betting versus calling, not just hands that would be indifferent and would make the same amount of money by calling as they would by 3-betting. These hands we're going to call. That will keep our 3-bet stat down, and it will allow us to turn more of these grey hands into red hands and just 3-bet more of our would-be folding range. That will increase the number of hands we're going to play in this spot in general, and will increase our EV with our range when we have high fold equity and the ability to flat. Linear 3-betting is the opposite. We don't have this bluffing range anymore. We 3-bet these hands at the far right. We may just do that for value, but we may also do this for isolation. Like we saw, if in the last example we'd had regs in the blinds who were very active and squeeze happy, we would actually be wanting to 3-bet as a means of entering the pot to keep our range uncapped. And we saw all the reasons for that at the start of this series when we were doing the first pre-flop segment. So we know that already, but there's other times you'd go linear just because you have a lack of fold equity. So basically, if you think about it, the polar range is going to be used when when we both have a calling range and high fold equity. You need both of these things. That is an and clause. You need both of these things to be true, to be polar, as we saw. So to be linear, there's two ways that you can do it. You can either be linear because you don't have a lot of fold equity. That would be the top line, the top spectrum there. Or you could be linear because you don't want a calling range, and then your only way of entering the pot is to 3-bet. So note that I've not called this 3-bet value, because in the top model there, these 3-bets may not be for value. A lot of them might just be to isolate a weak player who min-opened or something like that. And the bottom figure there, the 3-bets may be out of the small blind, whereas we know we play a 3-bet or fold game for the most part, unless we have exceptional big blind circumstances behind us. So in that case, we're not 3-betting necessarily for value. We're doing it as our means of entering the pot. In the top case, we're 3-betting maybe to isolate someone. It's not necessary that the hand is in great shape when called, because there's lots of other factors there that will lead to high EV if we're isolating a weaker player. So these linear ranges don't depend on every hand in the 3-bet range being a value 3-bet. They might do in some situations, but there's a lot of other reasons to 3-bet linear. Basically, the linear requirements are kind of the inverse of the polar requirements. If you have either low fold equity, and this is going to be an or clause, or we have no calling range, then we're not going to be polar, therefore we're going to be linear, at least until we meet mixed strategies. Basically here, the times we're going to be linear are going to be the times when our fold equity is lower, or we don't want a calling range. In that case, there will either be no need to 3-bet weak hands in the former, or in the latter case, there'll be nothing to separate bluffs from value. Remember, the rest of the world is key for having a North Pole and a South Pole. Without the rest of the world, those notions don't make any sense. So when you're using a linear strategy, the idea is here in the second model, we don't have a calling range. We have nothing to separate the extremities. Therefore, everything gets merged together. You could even call a linear range a merged range or depolarized range. A lot of these words are kind of half synonyms. So that's your linear 3-betting. From the top down, starting at aces, going down there from strong to weak and stopping at wherever you want to introduce the calling range or the folding range, depending on whether you have the calling range in the first place. Here's an example of linear. We used the mixed color there for some reason. The orange should be green, but whatever. You can forgive me for that slight inaccuracy. We have an aggro rec opening here. So evidently against this kind of player, opening the cutoff to $6, we do not have high fold equity, right? So right off the bat, we are just not allowed to be polar because we don't have high fold equity. Do we want a calling range in this spot? The answer is that we do, because we have passive players behind us again, and there's some small pocket pairs, small suited connectors that we just want to creep into this pot with and try and outflop the aggro player and then get paid off, rather than 3-bet bluffing against an aggro recreational. That just doesn't make sense. Our fold equity will be between 10 and 20% on a good day. So because of that, we only have one of the requirements that we need to be polar, and we only need one of those red X's there to become linear. We either need low fold equity or we need no calling range. We do have low fold equity. So that OR clause is going to make us become linear. We do not want the polar strategy in this spot. It wouldn't make any sense. We'd be 3-bet bluffing. We'd be using a really tight value range when in fact we want a wide value range. This is a linear spot. We'll 3-bet most of the hands that we play here to isolate this recreational, but we will call some at the bottom, as you can see here. So here we have no 3-bet bluff range. We just have hands that we're 3-betting. Again, this is not clearly for value because when we 3-bet 9-7 suited, it's not that we're saying that we're ahead of his range. We're more just saying that the hand will play well enough in position that we want this guy all to ourselves. We want to be greedy, become the sole beneficiary of his mistakes, and isolate that player type, a very common theme. With the weaker hands that don't have as much 3-bet pot potential, this is another concept we looked at in the first pre-flop segment, we're going to be calling and we're going to be sneaking into this pot to just try and use our position and our implied odds to play these connectors and play these suited gappers and play these low pocket pairs for a call. And we're actually happy to welcome in some players in the blinds when we have these hands that have some nut potential, basically. The idea is that with 10-9 off, if we build the pot, we're just not flopping enough nutted stuff that we want to be in a big pot with a recreational with low fold equity. But when we have something like 9-7 suited, the suitedness of the hand is going to make up for the lack of fold equity somewhat and give us a lot more nut potential. But 9-7 suited is close, 8-7 suited. These hands, 10-8 suited, etc. These hands could go into the blue range as well. We have to draw the line in the sand somewhere, and we've chosen to draw it there. So this is a linear strategy. It's 3-betting from the top down, mostly for value, but some hands are just in there for isolating the weaker player, and then we have these lower frequent strength hands that just want to creep into the pot and try and flop something good. So that's how you should play this spot, somewhere around here. Don't feel squeamish about 3-betting something like Jack-10 suited here. You don't need to be ahead when you have a skill advantage and a positional advantage. Your hand will be fine in terms of equity, but even if it wasn't, you could have enough implied odds there and just outplay potential against this opponent that you still want to 3-bet that hand. Linear example 2. Here we have 2 pros in the blinds here, and we have a timid reg raising to $6. So this player is going to be folding a lot. So in this case, we can say that the high fold equity is definitely present. The downside is that calling anything in this spot is a big no-no, especially in a high rake game. So with these 2 pros behind, it's going to become pretty disadvantageous to start building that flatting range, and it's going to become a lot better to play 3-bet or fold. If we're playing 3-bet or fold, that's right, we're not going to be 3-betting king-queen, folding king-jack, but 3-betting king-10. So we're not going to have this gap. A folding range isn't going to separate the North Pole from the South Pole, so that doesn't make any sense. If we don't have a calling range, there's nothing to separate the 2 polar extremes, so we don't have a polar range, we have a linear range. No calling range equals linear. We just need one of those clauses to be true, either no calling range or no fold equity or low fold equity. It'll look something like this. Here we're just 3-betting everything we want to play. We are still using some weak hands here to benefit from fold equity. We do also bear in mind that there's 2 very aggressive players behind us, so if we step too far out of line here, I'm just assuming pros are aggressive, they generally are, right? These 2 pros are going to cold 4-bet us, they're going to make life difficult. So if we start expanding this, we would like to expand this more, and if we had weaker opposition behind us, we would, but we're being a little bit reserved here, mainly for the reason that this timid reg is, yes, he's folding a lot, but the guys behind us are going to punish us if we step too far out of line. So a fairly snug but very playable linear range here, entering the pot for a 3-bet or not at all. Next time we're going to move on to mixed 3-betting, which is closer to GTO, like I said, and this is going to give us a feel for how to understand which hands are just indifferent to whether they call or whether they 3-bet, and to give those hands equal or equal-ish representation in both a 3-bet range and a calling range. And this is us getting much closer to playing something optimal. So mixed 3-betting is going to be for use against guys that either fold a sensible amount or the fold equity is just unknown. They seem like a solid player. If we have any clues that we can exploit, we use a polar or linear strategy where applicable. This has been Pete Clark for RunItOnce.com. I will see you guys on the next episode 16 for mixed 3-betting, and good luck at the tables until then. Bye for now.